coming today directly from Hartford, Connecticut, to share his expertise with our global community. And I am talking about Larry Boyer, ladies and gentlemen. Larry is going to discuss leading business transformation in times of disruption, from COVID-19 to the fourth industrial revolution. Larry is the author of The Robot in the Next Cubicle: What You Need to Know to Adapt and Succeed in the Automation Age. As a business leader and advisor, he connects technology, analytics, and economics to business operations and strategy to lead digital transformation and increase sales and profitability. He has been on the board of advisors for the Rutgers Big Data Program, Tech Pakistan, and Open BDA. Larry, we are all thrilled to have you sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about really, digital process automation and how it interacts with disruptions. And we've been experiencing for the last year, we're still experiencing disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic. And more broadly, we have been in the early stages of the fourth industrial revolution, where there's lots of more disruption happening and still to come. So I want to help everybody understand a little bit about those kinds of disruptions so that we are ready and prepared for future disruption, even though it might be different in nature than COVID-19. The fact that it's disruptive to business processes, to the way we live our lives, the way we work, that's all what's in common to it. And what is the role that digital process automation, business process automation, robotic process automation has all of that? So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is just to set some of the context about that, to help understand about exponential change, tipping points, and disruptions, the natures of evolution and revolution, and then looking at kind of the strategies and change management and business transformations, and what are some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic, especially for leaders, as we go into future disruptions. And I'll just add, even if you just turn on the news today, right, there is disruption happening around the world, and there's disruption that we can see that it may not be happening or impacting us today, but it's going to be impacting us long into the future, right? So we can see things from, here in the United States, we've got disruptions to a gas pipeline due to a cyber attack. We've got COVID-19 hitting in India and getting worse, and how that's going to impact supply chains around the world. And many, many others. Okay, there's just disruption all around us. So what do we do with that? Okay, so first let's just take a look at automation, just understand the different types. We've been talking about that a lot this week, so just a quick review, right? Business process automation, we're looking at using technologies to just refine how our business process works. A lot of that has to do with changing how people and the humans in the system operate. Right, we move into digital process automation, where we're using automation to improve the workflows using both software and humans. And then the robotic process automation, where we're using kind of intelligent computer software, right, the artificial intelligence and the machine learning and others, to automate repetitive processes and to gain additional insights. Oftentimes, right, the robotic process automation, the objective there is to replace a lot of what the human tasks are in the business process. So first of all, what we want to do is just think about a little bit, right? How future-proof are your automated processes, regardless of what type they are, right? So we've talked about, again, we've seen disruptions all around us. So are your business processes able to handle any of these kinds of disruptions? How long will your process be relevant? So technology is changing, customer preferences are changing, the way we do business, right? We see that with COVID, right? How we even do business is changing. So are our processes that we have and that we have invested in, are they still relevant today? Do we need to reimagine them? right? We've been reimagining them a lot over the last year, and much of that is in a crisis mode. At some point, we need to sit down and just think, okay, well, we've made a lot of changes. How relevant are some of them? What ones do we want to keep? Which ones do we need to go back in and fix and make more efficient and more effective? How can we look forward to the future and think about this in better ways? Yeah, are you likely to receive your projected return on investment for some of these, right? A lot of times, process automation is an expensive process. So again, the world has changed. Is it time to decide, okay, do we keep going on with the project we've got? Do we pause it, assess where we are and move forward? Or do we know that enough already that, we just have to scrap what we've been working on and build something new, right? So how important is that? Okay, how will our processes withstand different types of disruptions? So we should be thinking about what are all the different types of disruptions that are going on. Again, we talk about COVID-19. Another one that's been in the news lately is the microchip shortage, right? How is that going to affect you? And even if you're not a direct user of microchips, so like a computer manufacturer or an automobile company, right? Look further down the supply chain to where it impacts you, right? So are you going to be able to buy computers for your staff? How long will it take? You might be accustomed to being able to order a computer and having it the next day. Maybe it will take months now, right? You have to start thinking about these things because it takes time for the disruptions to work their way through the entire system. And thinking about that, we've talked about adaptability and agility, especially in people and the business, right? But when you're looking at the process itself, and whatever it is that you've automated, how adaptable is that process? And some of that is about coding. There are best practices about making coding much more flexible than sometimes what people do. Right? And we want to make sure that it is flexible in the maximum possible way so that when there is a shift, right, you can take your process, your automation, and adapt it to a new circumstance. Right? It's a lot easier to go and change a set of code that has been set up to be changed than it is to go back and try to rework something right from the beginning because the code itself wasn't adaptable. So we want to be thinking about something like that as well. Right. So with that, right, we want to make sure that when you start out on your process automation journey, you want it to be future-looking and strategic. Right. Oftentimes, what we're looking at is we just look at a process and we say we want to automate this in some way. Right. So how far can we automate it? Or, we're looking just at some digital automation, or we're going to try to automate the human interaction away from it and do RPA, whatever it is, right? But we're looking at the existing process as it exists today. Right. What we need to do before investing in such a project is to think about the future, right? And how can this process change? How is it likely to change moving forward? What disruptions can happen to the business that will make this process need to change and adapt, so that when you're designing the process, you can have that already incorporated. All right. So you want to think about the sources of disruption in that design process and say, how is our business going to be affected by what kinds of automated processes? Oftentimes what's happened is, especially in larger companies where they have disaster recovery teams, right? This is just left in a silo and said, okay, we can't do our work in our office. We have a disaster recovery area. The disaster recovery team comes in, they sets up the new area, and in you go to work. Obviously, that didn't happen with the pandemic, right? Everybody's disaster recovery plan was to end up going and working from home. But we need to be thinking about these things ahead of time and designing them into the process. So let's just take a moment and look at three of these change concepts. And these can be interrelated. These aren't mutually exclusive. We often talk and hear a lot about exponential change, and people are looking for things that are exponential change. And we live in exponential times, and you hear about that a lot in terms of technology. looking for people or companies that are trying to be disruptive, right? We like to look at unicorn companies that come in and disrupt the status quo, right? And so that's all very important and real, right? We have to understand that, right? The whole point of exponential change is that it starts out slow, and it may look like nothing for a long time before there's a sudden increase in it, right? And there was a lot of talk at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Because we know from science that the ways that diseases spread and become a pandemic is it follows an exponential growth path, unless there is something that can stop it. And in fact, with COVID-19, right, our immune systems weren't adapted to it, so it was able to spread rapidly and grow exponentially. But we can think about that in other terms, right? If you ever look at, think about Amazon and how its growth has happened over the years, right? For even most of its existence to this point, right? Amazon wasn't profitable. People never thought it would take off. They thought, oh, it's just a little online bookstore, somebody else will come on and take care of it. And Amazon will be relegated to the dustbin of the .com businesses. And that never happened. Right now, it is one of the most valuable companies in the world. It's seen as both beneficial for, as helping us get through the COVID-19 crisis, but it's also seen as a threat to a lot of businesses, both small and even larger ones, right? So even companies like Walmart, which would have ignored Amazon years and years ago, now see and understand it as a competitive threat because it went through this exponential kind of growth path. Then we have tipping points, where, again, about decision, right? Something's going to happen with disruption, right? So we're in some sort of balance, and then eventually something happens, and then it can happen quickly or slowly, but inevitably the scale is going to tip. Okay, and so, and there's little or nothing that you're going to do about that. So sometimes we hear about that in terms of climate change is an example of that, right? Where we're looking at a tipping point of what's happening in the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's ecosystem. Do we know that there's a point where, there's a point of no return where we're not going to be able to fix what's happening? And so people are very interested in answering that question. And how do we manage that? But that happens with businesses as well. It happened again with the pandemic, right? There was a tipping point where, if it didn't get under control, it was just going to spread like wildfire, right? And that's ultimately what happened, right? It wasn't controlled fast enough. And so COVID-19 rapidly spread around the world, and there was going to be nothing that was going to be able to stop it. And then we can look at disruptions, which can be an event that moves us suddenly from what exists today to something new. Okay, and so a lot of times we'll see again that with the use of technologies, right? So right, the advent of, we have cloud computing, right? Where we move suddenly from, mainframes and a lot of on-premise computing solutions to the cloud, right? Once it was there was a rapid shift to it, and suddenly you're there. We see that a lot with when we're talking about in terms of like industrial revolutions, or there's major shifts that happen, and they happen quickly, maybe not instantly, but fairly quickly. And so it's important to understand the nature of that as opposed to something that is a more slow type of change. Which brings us to understanding the difference between evolution and revolution, right? Because there's always change happening, right? It's we always hear people saying, well, change is the only constant these days, and we hear that over and over again, right? But so evolution is just about the incremental change, whereas revolution is really about the creation of something new. With evolution, we're usually talking about focus on a single system, a single process, a single product, a single technology. Right. So an example there is the evolution of different smartphones. Right. So right, you can have the iPhone 6, the iPhone 7, the iPhone 8, the iPhone 9. Right. Those are just all evolutions of the same item. revolution comes from the creation and convergence. And I think that's important, right? Bringing together of technologies and systems and processes from across industries to create something that's brand new. Again, the smartphone can be a good example of that, right? So we used to have telephones, we had cameras, we had computers. Bring in the smartphone, it combines all of those, and it becomes disruptive. And we can look at that, right? How many people these days have line phones, right? That is something that is disappearing because we all have a smartphone and a small computer, right? Just sitting right in our hand all the time. Evolution is something that changes the way that we live and work, our business functions, the way the governments operate. Revolution results in a fundamental disruption in the way that we do this. And in a very fundamental way that's different. What we usually see with a revolution is a change in what we call the social contract. We've seen that in all of the past industrial revolutions, where we've decided that the way that we work, the way that we interact with each other in society has to change. So we can think about effects of that in past revolutions, right? The 40-hour work week comes from that. The elimination of child labor, the social security systems. Right? These are all examples of how the social contract has changed as a result of something that's in a revolution. When there is a revolution, because of that, these kinds of changes that happen, there's often a lot of political turmoil. Political turmoil, because of all of those changes, also impacts business. It also impacts what your processes are. Think about this today. You know, again, I'm here in the United States, but I imagine that there are some of these issues in other places around the world where we're talking about the use of unemployment and the safety net, and whether or not that discourages people from working because there are jobs that are going unfilled. Is that a problem? On the flip side of that, people are losing their jobs. Employers also aren't necessarily hiring everybody back. You know, and how do we manage through that? What happens with people who are near the end of their careers, where it's more difficult for them to move back into the workforce, especially at the same level that they were at before? Lots of changes, right? And so societies around the world are starting to grapple with these things. We're meaning to grapple with them. We're also seeing it even with the COVID-19, right? You know, do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? Are we ready to open up business? Are we ready to go back to normal? All of this is happening, right? So this is all part of our social contract with each other. Okay, black swans and paradigm shifts, right? So the term black swan was popularized probably about 20 years ago now, right, as being a rare event, right? We see it as a one-time occurrence. They're statistically possible, but unlikely. They're those once-in-a-lifetime events, and then you hear about them, the stock market crash, or the big hurricane that comes through, or the typhoon, the pandemic. Black swan event. Paradigm shifts. These are also rare, right, and one-time occurrences, but their impacts are sudden, right? But we see it move from a way of thinking to a different way of thinking, right? With a black swan event, we just pretty much, there's the disruption, we deal with the mess that it creates, and then we go back to what we were doing before. But here's the thing with black swan events. I just want you to take a moment and pause and reflect on this, right? How many once-in-a-lifetime events have you experienced or heard about? Take some time, even now or later today, and think about that. Okay, I've heard, throughout my life, oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event, once-in-a-lifetime event. So just examples. Here's the stock market crash last year, flooding in Houston, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, right, which happened literally overnight. Enron, the financial crisis, the pandemic. Here we see the spraying disinfectants in China, terrorism, hurricanes. Right, and the point here is that there are lots of once-in-a-lifetime events that happen. They probably happen much more frequently than we like to think about, okay? The specific event or specific source of the disruption may not be predictable. Know that there is disruption and it is happening, and it is happening all around us, literally all the time. So where does disruption come from that we need to think about, right? Obviously, we think about technology, and especially when we're talking about business process automation and DPA and RPA, technology is the first place that we look at. But it's not the only source, right? And the technologies that we use with the DPA and RPA need to be able to adapt to the other things, right? So political changes. In the United States, we just had an election. We changed presidents, policy directions, big shifts, big changes in priorities. People who were winners under the previous administration now lose out. New winners come, and they switch back and forth, right? So that affects business. We see that with economic shocks, economic cycles. Demographics are another one, and this is an important one. I don't think enough people are paying attention to changes in demographics around the world, and how they are different from country to country. Right, where we have in some countries like Japan, where there are low birth rates and the aging population is growing, or we look at other countries, especially in the developing world, where there is a very small aging population, but an exploding population of youth. And what does that mean? Lots of implications for that, both in terms of business and opportunities, but also politically and geopolitically. What happens, when a lot of these youth can't get jobs? Youth unemployment is a big issue in many places around the world. That needs to be solved. We have disruptions coming from health, Mother Nature, competitors. We've seen criminals, cyber attacks, governments attacking each other in different ways. We also need to look not outside of our own little bubble to adjacent markets and where disruption can come from other areas. We can see disruption coming from individuals' creativity. People have necessity. They need to create something new so that the disruption comes through. Sometimes we can think through something and make it disruptive. Another source where we can get disrupted is if we become complacent or overconfident. Right? Then that sets us up for failure or sets us up to be disrupted. And we see that happen all the time as well. So we have to stay on top of potential disruptors. We can't just sit still. We have to be aware that change is happening all of the time. Our processes have to be updating all of the time. We have to be looking to the future. So what I'm hoping to do here is, having laid out all of that, right, is to help get you to be thinking about what you need to be doing is constantly thinking about connecting the dots. Right, so think about the sources of disruption, right, from the macro sources, looking at our industries, adjacent industries, looking within our own firm and competitive firms, and the individuals. And where are the disruptions that can happen there? Then we need to start looking at the convergences and connections, right? Because we want to see how things are connected. Again, supply chains are the easy way to think about that, right? They're naturally about connections. But also looking at how these technologies can combine, how some of these sources of disruption can combine, and then what they mean for us. And how can we take advantage of them? Or how can they be a threat to us? We have to understand that, and how do we adapt to those? And lastly, I think we need to also be taking a look at what we kind of think about in terms of our sacred cows. What do we need to do to keep? These are kind of our operating principles that we have, right? Short-term profit versus long-term sustainability. Right, when we're talking about disruption, this becomes a real important topic. Right? So process automation, a lot of times it's about just looking at the short term, making increasing profit, increasing efficiency. Right? We've seen that in some of the presentations. But if you're not looking at where the business is going, where the threats are coming from, you're going to miss out on some of that, and you're going to be building processes that may not be relevant in the future or may not be adaptable to the future environment, so you need to combine them. As leaders, we also need to be thinking about things that are these career-defining decisions and taking risks. Right, and again, let's just look back at COVID-19 and the decisions that leaders in governments at all levels, at corporations, again, at all levels, at any kind of institutions, the decisions that are being made about, do you tell people to go home and start working from home? Do you tell people to stay in? Are you worried about people panicking? How do you manage your business? How do you meet your customers' needs? Especially at that beginning. And as a leader, you have to be able to make those tough decisions, and you might be wrong, and be ready to live with that and move forward. So let's just take an example for a moment and think back about what's happening with the newspaper industry, just as an example about how disruptions and technologies all come together. Right? And what we see here in the newspaper industry is ultimately, they didn't really put all of these pieces together. Right? So you had television, radio, and newspapers as a means of communicating information that evolved a little bit into cable TVs and satellite TVs, and then eventually into internet and social media. We also have the means of delivery changing. We had landlines, we had film, we had record players, the newspapers themselves physically, moving those over to then ultimately cell phones and digital cameras, right, the portable media players. All of those got combined into the smartphone, right, to the point where today, right, we just largely use our smartphone, and in some cases, still our laptops or PCs to interact on the internet and social media. Right? And this is where people get most of their information these days, rather than the way it used to be in the newspapers. Right? And we see that when you look at the paid circulation of daily newspapers in the United States. This is from 1985 to 2018, right? It is just plummeting. So, what we want to think about here is, how can this happen to me? Whatever business you are in, technology is disrupting the business. What can you do in order to avoid this from happening? Right? We've heard that people want to say, well, we want to avoid becoming the next Blockbuster, right? Because they missed the opportunity to go digital. And that's true with a lot of companies, right? So how do you do that? It's all about connecting all of the dots. I just wanted to take a moment here also just to reflect, again, we're talking about the pandemic and its disruptions. Just think back to where we were a little over a year ago, and the decision making that has to go on, and then what processes were in place at the time to deal with what was happening. What would we do differently? Right, the China lockdowns happened relatively quickly with relatively low numbers. Right, when you look at this, right, China lockdown starts and you can barely see the number of cases. The lockdown started in Europe soon after that, and it didn't take too long. That was in February. We look here, the number of confirmed cases, just going up and up and up. Right, so knowing what you know now, what do you wish you had in place to handle it? This is a good time to think about, right? There was a major disruption. We've spent the last year just trying to catch up and adapt. But now let's think about that, right? The next disruption is going to come. We don't know what it's going to be. And it's going to be different for everybody here, right? Regardless of what your industry is or what your company is. Something is going to disrupt you. And what that is, it's going to be very specific to you. What would have happened, think about this, if the pandemic had happened 5 years ago, right, where we didn't have the state of technology that we have today, right, the state of business process automation, right? So think about that, right? So where are the wins, right? So that as much as there were struggles, there were a lot of things that were happening right for a lot of companies as well. What worked well? So after disruption, right? What's next, right? So COVID-19 is a great example here, right? It disrupted the way that we work and we live. And now some of us are looking to, how do we get back to normal? A lot of us are asking, what does normal even mean now? Right? So we all have to define that. Think about that for all of your business processes, right? What is normal now? Do you really want to go back to the way things were before? Or is there a better way of doing things now? Right? Have we learned things that make us better and smarter, more effective? And what can we do to move those forward? And I hear lots of stories about people, and the work from home movement may be one of them, where for a lot of people, they're able to work from home even more than ever imagined before, because in a lot of places this worked out very well. In some places not as well. So again, individual decision based on the company's needs, the processes needs. Right? And then let's think about this, right? Do the automations that we have now in place still make sense? Do they need to be fixed? Do they need to be made more adaptable? Right? Usually anything that's done in a quick way needs some fixing at the very least. Right? But go back, like we mentioned earlier, let's think about the future disruptions. Let's be strategic about it. So don't just jump in and automate something. Don't just jump in and say, okay, let's just start fixing what we did. Take a moment and think about what makes sense for the future. What is the future process we want to do, and let's build that. Okay, so again, thinking the role of automation in navigating disruption. I think one of the important things that we've learned here is to be thinking in terms of the augmented workforce as a strategy, not just simply focusing on the process. It's very easy to say, okay, let's map out the process. Let's see where we do things. Let's think about it a little bit more than just that, right? How do we augment people, right? So rather than just the process, what else can we incorporate into it that maybe we're not thinking about in a literal sense that can help make people more effective, help reduce repetition, and help enable the workforce to actually be more productive and more engaged in what they're doing, more involved in higher level tasks. Automation, as we can see, it can mitigate disruptions, right, because it can help maintain operations and profitability, especially in the short term, due to some of these external shocks. Automations can also be reconfigured. One of the nice things about them, if they're done well, you can go in and you can change them and adapt them to whatever the new paradigm is. Right, and so that can make you very agile and adaptable. On the flip side of it is, if you're looking at this, you've spent a lot of money building this process automation, and you're not sure where you're really going to need it in the future, but you're not going to let it go because you've spent and invested a lot of money in it so far. So you're going to keep it going. Okay, so one of the things we have to think about is, do you really need this, and are you ready to let it go to move on to the next thing? Right? And one other, I think, key point on this, right, is using automation for data gathering and analytics to understand the changing environment. So that includes what consumers want, what their buying patterns are, what they're looking for. Right? And so you see a lot of that in consumer goods for certain. Right? What is it that people suddenly want? Understanding the nature of that, and then how that comes back into your business. How do you relate and communicate to your customers? How do you change your business processes? How do you change your supply chain? We saw all of that disruption happening. So use automation as an intelligence gathering mechanism as well. As leaders, what has the pandemic taught us? So I think one of the important themes here I want to think about is anticipatory leadership, right? As a leader, you want to be thinking about and anticipating and responding rapidly to whatever changes happen. Right? So you want to know, you may not know what exactly is going to happen in the future, but think about, here's 2, 3 things that might be happening. What is my plan for acting in the case of action A, B, or C, so that we can move forward with them? And if I guessed A and the app turns out to be B, how do we move over and switch to it? Leadership mindset has also been important, right? Bringing people together, right? Understanding that we're all in this together, understanding that this is something that's new, right? Whenever there's a disruption, it's new. We don't have crystal balls. We don't know what's going to work out perfectly. We just move forward, understand that something that we might call a mistake will be made. We learn from it, adapt, and move forward. Taking leadership of all of your stakeholders. We want to be adaptable and flexible to both the business and the human needs of all of your stakeholders, whether they are shareholders, customers, employees, business partners, right? And I think we've seen a lot of that. We've seen, especially with Zoom meetings where we have family members coming in and, all these little accidental things, noises, and people have been very understanding about that. So being understanding and adaptive and flexible to that, right? So, and at the end of the day, as a leader, right, decisiveness, agility, and creating shared vision are necessary for this, right? So you have to, as a leader, get out and communicate with everybody. Where are we going? And then how are we going to do it, right? In an agile way, and just be decisive about it. Indecisiveness leads to fractured responses that usually don't work well. So I'll just close here with this quote from Wayne Gretzky. I love this, right? So he always said, he skates to where the puck is going to be, not to where it has been, right? So that, as a business leader, is where you want to be, right? You want to be looking forward and moving forward in that direction, and looking at how do all of your automations work to help create that future, not just where you're at today. And with that, if we have questions, or if people have lessons that they want to share, I'd love to hear those as well.
Fantastic, Larry. Very, very good coverage. We appreciate that. Number of questions, comments have happened that have taken place while you're presenting. I'm going to bring several of those to you in the time that we have available here. First one is related to strategic planning. Is strategic planning dead as we have understood it for the last few decades? Or what is the role of strategic planning in a world that's changing at a rapid pace?
Strategic planning is needed more than ever, right? Because you need to anticipate what is going to happen. It will change. The nature of strategic planning may change because you may need to plan for more events or more possibilities than you have in the past, right? So we're in a period of stability, say between industrial revolutions, right? We kind of know where things are, and now our strategy is based on, how do we maneuver within the system to produce the best outcomes that we can. But now, when we're in a time of rapid change and disruption, our strategic planning should become a little bit more broad and thinking about where are the disruptions possibly coming from. We should be thinking about how components can come together. I think, like the newspaper example, right? What pieces of technology are out there that can be put together to create a threat or an opportunity for me, right? And so some companies are very good at doing that, others less so. Usually it's a matter of effort and timing, right? So if you spend time, and it doesn't have to be a lot, to just think about all of these possibilities, you can then incorporate that into your strategic planning process. And then you can be adaptable to it, right? But until you understand what the universe of possibilities is that's out there, you're not going to be ready for it, right? You're going to be always reacting rather than responding, right? And you want to be, as a leader, in a position where, okay, I've thought about that already. I may not know all of the answers to it, but I've at least thought about it, and I know I want to go in this direction, and we'll figure out all of the details. from there. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. Although I must say that I work with a lot of organizations, and I cannot think one that had a pandemic in 2020 as part of their sophisticated scenario planning exercises. So it's very hard to predict the future, right? And that's the big draw. I remember being back in grad school on a modeling class, which I really enjoyed, and I had a professor that was very inspiring. And one of the things that he used to say, and I love his quote, is that there are only two types of people who predict the future: those who don't know and those who don't know that they don't know. And this in the context of a modeling class, right? So it's you can take that context. So very true, but it's so hard to predict this rare events, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think the important takeaway is, specifically what it is, you may not know, but we should all know and understand that there are disruptive forces around us all the time, and we need to be ready for and adapt them. And you know what, we may not know what they all are, but we know what some of them are. And we may not know what the timing is, but we know it will happen, right? So I think about like hurricanes. When we think about what Hurricane Katrina did to New Orleans, right? We know that that's possible. We didn't think it was highly likely, right? And we respond that way, right, from that statistical standpoint, right? But we need to understand that, well, that is possible, and maybe it's going to be more possible in the future, as storms become more intense. We can think about some of these things, right? I will say, to your comment about a pandemic, I do know, when I used to work at Freddie Mac, years ago, at least part of their business continuity plan, they did have a pandemic scenario in their planning. Of course, we never used it, at least up until now. But they didn't have something for, when I worked there, that's when the 9/11 attacks happened, right? Nobody was imagining a terrorist attack like 9/11.
And your point is very well taken. Absolutely, the directional guidance that you can develop as from strategic planning and scenario planning are absolutely very helpful still. Let me shift to two other comments that are happening here from the audience, and it has to do about navigating these times of uncertainty and rapid change. Unlikely that the future is going to be any slower changing than we have right now, and there are many potential reasons for that. But what type of two levels, what type of organizational capabilities and also professional skills are necessary to navigate uncertainty like that? What do you think that what muscles organizations and professionals need to exercise to be better prepared for the rough waters ahead?
Sure. So I think one thing that would be helpful for organizations to develop is have essentially listening posts. There are people, most organizations are large, they have people who are seeing and interacting with the world in different ways, but the information that they are gathering is not being funneled into a centralized place, right? Even if you have a competitive intelligence group that focuses on, well, what are my competitors doing today? What's the news? A lot of times it's just simply about gathering news articles and posting it, right? Right? But what other things and ways are there to funnel information that people are seeing develop, right? So new technologies, right? You have people in the IT areas, but you have people in business areas and other areas who are interacting with other technologies that the IT department is not. What are they seeing? How can that be used and adapted, and funnel that through and up for ideas about the business? So I think some way of, again, gathering information and funneling it to a central point where leaders can be more aware of what's happening and possible. That would be one of the things I think that would be fantastic for companies to do. Another is around empowering people. We hear a lot about empowering people, from everything from just being in charge of your own career to empowering employees as a way of improving engagement, reducing bureaucracy. still there's still a lot of work that has to be done in that area as well, because when we see disruption happening, people have to be able to respond to it and respond to it immediately. Leaders also need to understand and appreciate that people, when they do that and they take a risk, that they're doing the best they could in whatever that circumstance is, right? And so rather than penalize people, we need to start understanding and rewarding behaviors where people take risks when they believe that they are doing something responsible to help the organization and move forward. We see that, that has to just be part of an ongoing leadership development from top to bottom, right? Everybody is leaders. Let's develop everybody as a leader to be able to be more adaptable to these kinds of situations, right? So I guess my first point really is around centralization and creating a hub, and the other point really is around decentralization and empowering people, right? So we need a little bit of both. I would love to see organizations, enhance both of those areas. It's all about thinking strategically about the future.
That is fantastic. That's well said, Larry. Larry, on behalf of our global community today, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise, your insights. A fascinating journey on a very important topic for all of us. So thank you for your generosity, time, and insights.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Larry Boyer sharing the insights on transformation, from incremental changes to large disruptions, and fascinating review of the components of those changes and how we can better prepare for those changes that are going to continue to occur in the future. We are going to take a break now. We're going to wrap up this segment. I will be back with you at the top of the hour. We're going to shift from Hartford, Connecticut to Toronto, Canada. And we're going to have with us Steve Serafinovsky, who is the senior leader for capital projects at Metrolinx. Metrolinx is a transit and transportation organization in the city of Toronto in Canada. And Steve is going to be talking about implementing change and digital process automation in an environment where you have to overcome many challenges, much resistance, and how do you go beyond spreadsheets and automate from forms to dashboard in a system where it's difficult to change. It's a very traditional system where the openness to change may not be there right away. And how do you overcome those challenges, and how do you implement value creating change in the organization, and how you create intelligent automation for processes in an organization like that, and have, of course, great results that he'll share with us. So we'll meet Steve back at the top of the hour. Take a break now, and I'll see you back soon.